Hey everyone, welcome to part 4 of this tutorial series. In this video we'll be moving over to the front end where we'll be looking at a login form in Nordcraft that we build in Nordcraft to be able to connect to the Xano backend that we looked at in the previous part. So let's get into it. So here we are in our Nordcraft editor and I've already pre-built this login form here. In this video, I want to focus solely on calling Xano's API from our Nordcraft front end. So in the next video, we'll be going through how to build this login and we'll start to learn all that we need to do to put forms together and build our UI in Nordcraft. But in this one, let's stay focused on calling the API on our Xano backend. So we'll come over here to this icon for files, which you can click here, or you can press Command K or Control K if you're on a PC. And if you look down, we've got this section here for services. And so what this allows us to do is to set up a connection to the backend that we want so that we can then more easily get at the endpoints that it exposes. So we'll click to create a service. And it gives us these various options of the systems that they've got pre-built services for. Obviously, we're interested in the Xano one. So we'll leave the name Xano as it is. The next thing is it's asking us for this base URL. So essentially what it's asking us for here is to say, tell me where I can find your Xano server effectively. And so that's what we call a base URL. So if we go to Xano and I go to APIs and we've got authentication here, and all I need to do is to hover over this and we can see it gives us in the tooltip that is the actual base URL to connect to our Xano server to get at the endpoints in this API group. So I can click that, or I can go into the group itself and click on this copy base URL link. So that puts it in the clipboard. Let's go into Nordcraft again and let's just paste that in. Okay, now I press tab and Nordcraft has gone away and tested that connection, and now it is connected to our Xano server, in particular the authentication API endpoint group. So we'll click on the tick to confirm that. So our service is now set up. So we've established the connection, but obviously we need to get at the individual endpoints that are offered. In this case, our auth login. So to be able to access that specific endpoint, what we do is we come over to APIs and we click on plus next to it. Okay, and if you look here on the services, it recognizes that we've got Xano. Notice we've got REST there, which is why I wanted to make sure that you were aware of what these terms meant. Endpoint, we drop this down. Okay, and there's our endpoint that we want. Now obviously if we don't see it right away, we can just sort of type in a search and we can get to it quite easily, but that's the one that we want, so we can select that. Now by connecting to that service, it then knows which endpoints are exposed. We've selected from that list, and now it just sets that entire API up for us automatically. So what we can do here is actually run that from this front end. So if we click this little play button here, and we can see that we get an error basically. So we're missing a param, which is the inputs effectively that we were talking about before. So in other words, we're not actually passing anything in from our form. Okay, so we're going to need to do that. So essentially what's happening here at the minute is that when we type in an email address or we type in a password, they get put into these little pieces of information here, okay, what we call variables. But don't worry too much about that, we'll come back to that later on. But essentially this piece of information here holds what they type into the email box, what we call an input box, and the password stores what has been entered into the password box. So essentially then we need to pass those details into our API. Remember our inputs that we talked about previously, that's what we need to supply to it. If we go over here to the body section, what we can see is that Nordcraft has already recognized that it needs an email and a password. So it already knows that. So all we need to do is to say, okay, what information needs to go into that email and into that password. So to do that, we come into this little FX box here. At the minute, I'm just kind of giving you some seeding of what we do in Nordcraft. Take it into account. Don't worry too much about it at the moment. So we click on this FX. This is what we call a formula in Nordcraft. Again, don't worry too much about it. All that we're doing here is to enable us to call this API. So essentially it's saying that we need an email and a password, and it wants to know what is the value of that email and what is the value of that password. And so what we're going to do, we're going to grab it from our what we call variables. That are the values that are entered into the input boxes up here. Okay, so that's done. We've now connected up our values. Okay, so if I run this now, I'll just get the same error, so I won't do that. But what I can do is run this page, which is a login page, as you can see on the top left. And so we can run it from within the Nordcraft editor by clicking the little play button, or we can press T. So let's run that. So I'm going to just put in our email and password that we know is a valid user that we entered in the previous part of the tutorial. So we'll do abc123@test.com, and the password was please let me in. We click login. We've not actually done anything with that at the minute, so that's not going to work. However, let's pause the app and let's go back into the editor, and let's go back into the API. And now let's run that again. This time we've got our auth token, which, as we covered last time, means it's been successful. Notice that Nordcraft holds it in this section called data. So these are held in data, which represents the response body, if you like, the response data that we got back from Xano. Now let's have a look at this response section here. So if we open this up, it gives us a status. Now, when we're running REST APIs, the main thing to remember is that if it's successful, if we get a successful response, then the response status is always going to begin with a 2, generally a 200. So we can almost rely on the fact that if we get a status of 200, or it begins with a 2, the number 2, then we can pretty much rely on the fact that that has been a successful API call. The response has said everything's okay, here's your response, here's your data, off you go. Now if I run this again, and let's just take off that last character. Again, we haven't hooked up the login button yet, which we'll do in a moment. And let's run this again. Okay, we get an error, which is invalid credentials. And if we go to the response this time, our status is 403. So when we get a successful response, it begins with a 2. When we get an error response, it begins with a 4. So in this case, it's a specific error code representing the access denied. So that's why we get 403. If we were to do something like run that again and clear our values out, and let's run that again, we get this error, which is a different error, which is input error, and our response this time is 400. Okay, so we're getting different responses depending on the different conditions, but always, if it's an error, we always get a number that starts with 4. If it's successful, we always get a number that starts with 2. Again, not massively important at this point, but just something to remember and keep in mind, because we can actually use the response status that we get back when we call an API. Okay, so we've got our API running quite nicely now, but now what we need to do is to make sure it gets triggered when we click the login button. So in Nordcraft, the way that we make something happen in response to something is we use events. So you can imagine that there's a step of when this happens, do this. It's what we call responding to events or handling events. So when something happens, when an event happens, then we're going to do this. So what we need to do then is to have something that says when this button is clicked, then do this. And the do this element of it is what we call a workflow. So in the intro, I sort of mentioned about workflows, that we use visual workflows. And so you can imagine then if we go along with that saying of when this happens, do this, we can say when this event happens or is triggered, then we run this workflow. And that's essentially what we're going to do here now. So if we click on the login button itself in the form, notice the panel on the right hand side changes, and this is detail specific to this button. So we've got styling, attributes, events, and we can move between these by pressing either S for styling, A for attributes, or E for events. For this purpose right now, we're interested in events. So let's press E, or we can always click on the tab there, and it says that we've got no events added. But notice that we've got this section here for click, and it gives us an event. So we can actually give it an event to say that when that event happens, do this. Now, notice we can do lots of things here. We can respond to double click, to the context menu, which is like a right click, and there's all sorts of keyboard events. There's tons of stuff that we can do. Anything that you can do in a web browser programmatically, you can also do in here. Okay, so the one we're interested in, and the one that you'll do with buttons 90% of the time, is the click event. So again, we're working on that system of when this happens, do this. So when click happens, we need to then do a workflow. So let's click on that. And this is Nordcraft's workflow editor, and it keeps itself very subtle. We can go full screen with it if we need to do, but for this instance, we just need to add a single step. So you can call them steps, you can call them actions, depending on which way that you want to do. Generally in Nordcraft, we tend to call them actions. In Xano, we tend to call them steps. So here in our function stack that we looked at in the last video, we have our different steps, but you could call them actions, and we have a stack. One gets executed one after the other. Okay, and the same principle happens in Nordcraft. So what we want to do in this particular click event is we want to trigger the API that we've set up. So to add our action, we just click this plus. And if you look here, we've got this section here under APIs, call auth login, which is exactly what we want to do. So we select that, and that's it. Okay, that is now in response to the click event on our login button, is now going to trigger, or call rather, the auth login API. So let's give that a go now. Okay, so I'm going to put the right one in first. So let's do that. And please let me in. Hopefully I've tapped that right. So either way, it can be good. We can test it. So let's click login. I've successfully logged in. So that's great. So it's connected to the Xano server, and it's come back with a success result. Okay, let's try and remove something from there. Let's try this again. Great, so that all works. Let's put that back in, and let's take a letter off the password, make sure that works. There we go. Okay, so essentially now we've connected our Nordcraft front end to our Xano back end. Now at the minute we've just been testing it within the Nordcraft editor. So we're just running it, so within the same environment, we just, if you like, flicking between edit mode, which we're in here, and then test mode, which we're in here. Okay, to test it properly, we need to test it in its own tab in the browser, and to do that we can click on this button here, and that opens it up in its own browser page. So let's test it in here, outside of the editor. 3test.com. Please let me in. Okay, log in. There we go. So that's working as well. So this is running entirely standalone. We can see up here that this is the default domain name. At the minute I'm operating this through the free plan. Obviously if you were paid you could add your own domain name, and so you get your full domain name /login. The /login is the page name that we're on. Just do a quick test to make sure we do get an error back if it's wrong. Yep, couldn't log you in. Please try again. So we're now connecting from our Nordcraft front end into our Xano back end. Now again, it's important to remember that when we're running this, in fact, anything that you do from Nordcraft is running directly on the device. So on my Mac that I'm running this on now, the front end here, this page, is running directly on the Mac. It's running directly on my device. When it calls the API, this auth login, this is getting executed on Xano's server, or your server on Xano. Okay, so it's just important to have a clear delineation between what is happening here. So without getting too complicated or into the weeds with this, when we pop in this web address here, that is going to Nordcraft server. That is downloading all of the resources for your front end app, downloading them into the browser, and the browser is picking that up and then running it on the device itself. And that is essentially how web systems work. And then as and when we need to then go back to the server for data or to log someone in, then we call the API on Xano. So I've tried to labour the point just to make sure that you understand where the delineation is. And anything we put in workflows on the Nordcraft side is being executed on the user's device, on the front end app. So this type of workflow or function stack or whatever you want to call it, this type of workflow is run on the front end. This function stack in Xano is run entirely on the back end. That essentially concludes this video then. In the next one, we'll be going through a bit more detail in Nordcraft to start learning how to put a form like this together. So thanks for watching. Again, thanks for sticking with me, and I will see you in the next one.